Welcome to the Bloomington Rotary Club's weekly celebration of service for April 6th, 2021. I'm your current president, Ashley Wesley. Thank you for being here. Natalie, please show the flag graphic for 15 seconds of respectful silence. We ask that you remain on mute and take this time to personally reflect. Thank you. Now I'd like to introduce Martha Wales, who will be offering our reflection today. Martha?
Martha, you're muted. Oh, there you are.
There I am, yep. Finally, the federal government agrees we are Hoosiers. I'm going to read you a column that was written by Maureen Gropey in January of 2017. It's official, we're Hoosiers, not Indianians or even Indianans. So says the federal government on page 95 of the updated U.S. Government Publishing Office's Style Manual, released Thursday. That would have been 1917. The change came at the request of Senator Joe Donnelly and former Senator Dan Coates, who argued Indiana residents have proudly called themselves Hoosiers for more than 180 years, even if no one is sure of the term's origins. It's only non-Hoosiers who use the term Indianian. In fact, Donnelly and Coates wrote in a letter last year, we find it a little jarring to be referred to in this way. The senators had good timing. Their request was made as the GPO was working on the 31st edition of the manual that has served as the style guide for federal documents since 1894. It's also widely used as an editorial guide by people in the private sector. The updated version lists Hoosier as the term to designate a native of Indiana on a list that starts with Alabamian and ends with Wyomingite. Donnelly says he's pleased the federal government will now call us what we call ourselves. This is a welcome and long overdue change, he said. If you ever had to correct somebody who called you an Indianan, today's the day to celebrate. Senator Todd Young, who succeeded Coates, also praised the move. We aren't achieving world peace here, but it's nice to be recognized by the federal government as Hoosiers, he said. It's not just a classic movie. It's not just the nickname for IU athletics. It's who we are. Plus, Young said in a video announcement with Donnelly, if we can get the federal bureaucracy to agree with us on that, then I feel like there's nothing we can't do. Donnelly and Coates had noted the Merriam-Webster dictionary defines Hoosier as a native or resident of Indiana. Amtrak's Hoosier State Line carries passengers through the Indiana countryside. References to Hoosiers have been found in private correspondence, travel reminiscences, and local newspapers as early as 1826. The term gained popularity after Richmond poet John Finley wrote The Hoosier's Nest, which included these classic lines. The immigrant is soon located, in Hoosier life initiated, erects a cabin in the woods, wherein he stows his household goods. Coates and Donnelly said the poem, which was widely circulated throughout the country and even abroad in the 1830s, defined and solidified Indiana's identity and instilled pride in the citizens of the still young state. Well, we have become a mature state, still proudly and now officially calling ourselves Hoosiers.
Thank you, Martha. All right, we have one guest with us today, a guest of Jim Bright, Kirk White, IU Assistant Vice President. Hi, Kirk. Welcome to the club. We hope you'll come back and join us again. And thanks to our producers, Natalie Blaze, Michael Shermis, Sally Gaskell, and Aaron Davis for helping make this meeting happen. And our roundabout reporter for this week is Susie Graham. A few birthdays to celebrate. Our own reflector, Martha Wales, is April 8th. And Gus Shikalis is April 9th. Megan Gearhart is April 9th as well. And Martha Foster is April 11th. Happy birthday. 2 membership anniversaries. Board member Ron Barnes, 29 years as a Rotarian. And Matt Stitzinger, 5 years. Thank you for being a part of the Rotary family. And now for a major celebration. We would like to recognize our newest Paul Harris Fellow. Mike Baker, please take it away.
Well, somebody's got a tie on today. Anyway, oh, don't give that away. As most of you know, the presentation of the Paul Harris Fellow is Rotary Foundation's way of expressing its appreciation for a substantial contribution to the Rotary Foundation and for good service work within the community and the world. Paul Harris Fellow is named after the founder of Rotary, Paul Harris. And it's been harder to talk about why giving to the foundation is such a good thing during COVID and not being in personal meetings. But some of our members continue a little at a time to support the foundation, and it's greatly needed. Today, I'm very happy to present the Paul Harris Fellow designation and pin to a current member of our club, Trent Deckard. Trent's support of the foundation will continue all the good work Rotary does all over the world and in our own community. Trent arrived in our club just a short period of time ago. What was that, a hug? Oh, that's somebody coming over your shoulder there. Okay. Trent arrived in our club just a short time ago, and he's been helping our club and community in so many different ways. Trent will now join so many in our club and across the world as a Paul Harris Fellow. It's important recognition, and I hope all of you will recognize and celebrate Trent as a Paul Harris Fellow. Please join me in recognizing Trent Deckard as a Paul Harris Fellow. Congratulations, Trent.
Thank you very much. And I've got Madeline here to put my pin on me. So thank you for this tremendous honor. And thanks to Kyla, who is a huge supporter of me getting to this point. Thank you.
Wonderful, it's official.
Good.
Congratulations. It looks good on you. Okay, we have some Rotarians in the news. President-elect nominee, Alon Barker, was part of an Emeriti House presentation yesterday, Monday, April 5th, entitled The Music Business Peace Initiative. Alon presented along with Timothy Fort, professor of business law and ethics at the Kelley School, and Constance Cook-Glenn, the director of music and general studies at the Jacobs School. So congratulations. That was
Thank you.
nice.
I'd be happy to tell everybody about it sometime.
We'd love to have it. Maybe you should do a reflection soon.
That sounds good.
And we have a very happy announcement that I couldn't wait for Happy Dollars. Lauren and Morgan Snyder are new parents again to a baby boy, Lawson James Snyder. He was born Saturday, April 3rd, and their first son, Coleman, is now a proud big brother, as reported by Lauren and Morgan. So congratulations to them. I'm going to include their address in our roundabout, and I'll put it in the chat here. Let's shower them with love. Let's send them lots of cards and congratulations. I'm sure they would appreciate it very much, as now their family of 4 is on its journey. Remember to sign up for the district conference. It's happening on April 17th. And the more people we get there, the better, because we will be entered to win $1,000 for a service project if we have the highest percentage of attendance. So let's show up. Let's hear those speakers and engage in this district conference over Zoom, hopefully for the last time. We'll be in person together next year, fingers crossed. And now, Happy Dollars. Does anyone have any of their own Happy Dollars to share? No takers?
I'll
Sally.
share. I'll share. I'm happy because yesterday, April 5th, was the 6th anniversary of what I like to call George Shively Day. It's the day when 6 years ago, which was baseball's opening day that year, Bob Hamill and the Choir of Votus Novae and I and a number of community people, including descendants of George Shively, dedicated new tombstones at Rose Hill Cemetery in Shively's honor. He was, of course, a Negro Leagues baseball player who lived and died in Bloomington.
I've got one.
Go ahead.
Oh, hello. I just want to say that many of you know that I'm the president of the Buskirk Chumley Theater Board, and this year has been particularly challenging for us because the theater's been dark since last March, and we're still waiting for the audience limits to be raised enough, but we got news last week that we had qualified for our second PPP loan. And so we're ever more confident that we will be able to, be there when things open up, and we're really very much looking forward to it.
All right.
I've got 10 happy dollars for an incredible Rotarian and a wonderful person who's got their birthday coming up on the 11th, Martha Foster.
Why, thank you. I was just going to put in some happy dollars for visits from Aaron's oldest son and my daughter in the past week and a half. And it's just been absolutely wonderful to be able to see our kids in person and drive around in the same car and have them stay with us. So there is life beyond, post vaccinations, everyone. It's very good. Thank you.
I have one. I have 10 happy dollars in memory of Patrick O'Meara, who spoke to the club a few weeks ago or some time ago, and who was a really wonderful member of our community and of Indiana University. So in memory of Patrick, I have happy dollars.
I'm going to do the same. He was a dear, dear man. He was the first person I met in Bloomington when I first arrived.
A South African.
I will give $1 for the most wonderful and historical performance of the IU women basketball this year.
Yes.
I have one. I'll actually throw in $10, maybe a few more, but I want to congratulate the IU United Way campaign, which exceeded their goal, as is being reported in the news. And particularly one of our guests, Kirk White, was an absolute huge part of that. And we're just, all of us in that United Way family and beyond are very grateful for that leadership from Kirk and others. So congratulations, United Way and IU.
I would like to donate $5 in honor of the gradually decreasing number of days when it will be quiet, because when the ground hits 64 degrees, out will come the 17-year locusts.
Yes.
And they were over for a month and a half.
Thanks for the reminder, Owen.
And I've got another 10 happy dollars for the person who registers and bills us for our happy dollars and who does so much for this club, Natalie Blaze.
Hear, hear. All right, any other takers? All right, thank you for sharing all those happy moments and some sad in memory, but thank you for sharing. Without further ado, Michael Shermis, please introduce our speaker for today.
I'm thrilled to introduce our speaker because I had a conversation prior to setting him up to speak today, and I was fascinated. Besides obviously being really smart, it was just really interesting to know all the ins and outs of what's going on in Russia and how it relates to us, and so I think you're going to enjoy this. So our speaker today is Colonel Stephen J. Lacey. He's the United States Army War College Fellow at Indiana University's Russian and East European Institute. He is an Army Strategic Intelligence Officer from East Winnetachee, Washington, who received his commission in 1999. He's also a graduate of the Transportation Office Basic Course, Logistics Officer Advanced Course, Commander and General Staff College, Joint Foreign Officers Orientation Course, Strategic Intelligence Officer Course, Joint Military Intelligence Officer Course, Defense Strategy Course, and the Joint and Combined Warfighting School. Prior to his arrival in Bloomington, Indiana, he was assigned to United States European Command headquarters in Stuttgart, Germany, where he served as the Chief Northern and Eastern European Intelligence Security Cooperation Branch, responsible for promoting intelligence integration capacity and interoperability with over 25 nations. He is a Russian military subject matter expert with extensive experience in Eastern Europe and Eurasia. He holds an undergraduate degree in Russian and speaks fluent Russian and has multiple years of in-country experience in Ukraine and Belarus. He holds master's degree from the George Washington University of Business and the National Intelligence University, as well as a Juris Doctor from the College of William and Mary's Marshall Wythe School of Law. The list of his previous assignments, awards, and decoration other honors are too lengthy to list. But if you get the point that we're dealing with someone who is well pedigreed to talk to us about this topic, you're paying attention. Without further ado, again, Colonel Stephen Lindsay. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. It's nice to be with you. I'll get right to my presentation because we have limited time, and I think the most interesting thing that we can typically do is have a conversation or discussion at the end. So let me see if I can share screen properly. Oh, I did it. Look at that. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Let's see if I can get, there we go. Okay. So I'm going to go through this, and I hope you can, everyone hear me? Thumbs up if you can. Okay, good. And if you have questions at the end, please address them then. I'm sure there's a chat function also, but I'm going to try to run through this. I actually timed myself to make sure I could stay in color within the lines in 20 minutes, so I'll see what I can do. So you have my background, you know who I am. I've been doing this for a long time, and this is my passion. I've spoken to a number of groups about Russian strategic issues, and most of them are NATO allies, but others as well. So we'll talk about that. So here's the agenda I'm going to talk about today. So these are the slides I have. I'm going to talk about a little bit of a background to Russia's current situation. I don't know what you know about Russian history, and I'll try to be brief. That's its own lecture, but I'll be cursory and talk about how it relates to the current situation. The goals of Russia's grand strategy. For those who have studied Clausewitz or in the military, we talk a lot about ends, ways, and means. So I'm going to discuss what the grand strategy is, Russia's sphere of influence, the ways that Russia employs to accomplish that strategy, the means that it employs, some Russian fissures or areas of weakness that you might want to note, countering Russian interests. So how would someone counter those interests if they ran counter to either the US government or one of our allies or partners, and then time for discussion. So that's what we'll do. So here's the background I have. The first thing that I would tell someone in 2 minutes or less of what they need to know about Russia is to understand a few things in their historical perspective. So I'll try to run through this slide as quickly as possible, but I think it's critically important to understand if you're not a Russian specialist. The first is that Russia was the one country that is often considered part of Europe that did not enter the Enlightenment party. They had a completely different road to development than most of Europe. They didn't accept Roman Catholicism. They ended up with Christianity through the Byzantine Empire, and then later were conquered by the Mongols, as some were in Eastern Europe. And we're under that Mongol yoke for a few centuries, which made it difficult for them to have the same intellectual development as a civilization that others did. I call it coming late to the party. In addition, they have been in one of those geostrategic locations as a land power where they've constantly been through their history invaded by other nations from just about each direction except the north. Polar bears have not come down from the Arctic to invade en masse yet, but they've had Mongols from the east, they've had the Swedes, Poles, French, Germans from the West, from the South, they've had the Ottomans and Persians, and they've had enemies on all sides, and they have no natural border defenses. So that permeates Russian mindset of both not having the same level of development we had in the West for democracy, and also having the challenge of having to have a state focused on security historically. In the 20th century, they reached their apex. People don't realize this unless they think about it, but the Russian Empire, though quite large, was not as large as what Soviet sphere of influence was after World War II. After the Soviets did their best to conquer Nazi Germany, they kept those satellite states, as you all are aware of, in Central and Eastern Europe, and did not relinquish control. And so that sphere of influence in the 20th century was large, and that's part of the Russian mindset that apex happened recently. In the 21st century, the challenges that we have with Russia stem from a few issues. The first is that after the fall of the Berlin Wall and then the fall of the USSR, NATO slowly expanded into countries in Eastern Europe. That was very frustrating to Russia, who was powerless to stop it early on. So in the late 90s, when you had countries like Hungary and Romania and others that started getting NATO membership, Russia couldn't do anything about it. And then a few things started to change. In 2004, the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and I'll have a map later if you're not exactly sure where those are, they joined NATO in 2004. And those were the first post-Soviet satellite states of the USSR that joined NATO. And that was highly problematic, but Russia was not in a powerful position to counter that move. In addition, the Russian populace in the 90s was very pro-American, despite what you may have heard. And then a couple of things started to change. One was that NATO expansion, but the other was in 1999 when we had military operations in former Yugoslavia in the Balkans. The bombing of Belgrade was something that really turned Russian attention and Russian reaction against the United States. Russia has always protected Serbia. They went to war, and World War I happened largely because Russia supported Serbia, and they have always had interest in that region and kind of looked at themselves as protectors of Serbia and have strong ties. And that was on Russian television and caused a lot of consternation. Then later in 2008, something happened which was monumental. Despite all this NATO expansion that caused trouble for Russia in its mind, there was a NATO, the 20th anniversary of, it's a 20th NATO summit that happened in Bucharest, Romania in April of 2008. And at that meeting, the NATO allies agreed and had a public statement that said that they welcomed Ukraine and Georgia's Euro-Atlantic aspirations for membership to NATO. And they agreed to, at that time, that those countries would become eventual members of NATO. Russia flipped out. That caused all sorts of problems. In fact, I argue that led to the war in Georgia in 2008. In my slide, I talk about asymmetric balancing. And so what happened as a result of all those issues is after Putin came to power in 1999, the Russian military was in bad shape. So he decided to lead a Russian military modernization effort. So they poured tons of money into modernizing their military, lots and lots of money for that. And at the same time realized that they couldn't counter NATO toe-to-toe militarily, even if they wanted to. So they embarked on what people call asymmetric balancing. And so that meant things like large-scale cyber attacks in Estonia, using what you've heard, little green men, or small invasions of countries that led to frozen conflicts. And so those are all tools that Russia used because it couldn't go toe-to-toe with others. So when I talk about Russia's grand strategy, the Russian elite, and this is a broad term, right? Who is Russia's elite? I don't have time to define that. But there's broadly three main objectives that most scholars and professional analysts think that Russia has. The first is for Russia to be recognized as a great power. So the Russian government wants to be recognized as a great power. And that implies, if you're a great power, that you have a distinct sphere of influence. So in the US, you might remember from your history classes when you were younger, that, we talk about walking softly and carrying a big stick, and we had the Monroe Doctrine, and there was a sphere of influence that the US felt it had in this hemisphere. China currently feels it has a sphere of influence, and it doesn't like when foreign actors meddle. And Russia feels the same way, that if it's a great power, it should have a sphere of influence. And it feels that it should have predominance within that sphere of influence. And the third is a desire to see US influence curbed or scaled back. So Russia views the US as its main competitor, and it views these things as a zero-sum game, which means that if we lose, they win, right? If they can reduce our influence or our standing in the world, they increase their own. And if you understand that mindset, a lot of these things tend to fall into place. So those are three broad objectives. And it should be noted that Russia doesn't look at a big difference between the US and NATO. It recognizes that the US is about 70% of all of NATO's spending. We are in the US NATO. We keep it all. We're the glue that keeps it all together. And so when it looks at NATO, it recognizes there are all these nations, but we're the predominant force. And so it doesn't distinguish much between us and NATO unless it can drive a wedge there. Okay, so what's Russia's sphere of influence? It's really four main areas, and I hope you're still awake as I talk about this. The first is the former Soviet Union, right? So you might remember from your time in school, living through the Cold War as we did, what the former Soviet states are. And on this map, they were the three Baltic states: Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Belarus, Ukraine, and then you can see some of the Caucasus states there. Russia considers that proprietary. That's its space. Doesn't like the fact that the Baltic states are part of NATO. It can't do anything about that, and it kind of recognizes it, right? So it just, I don't want to say it writes that off, but it recognizes that's a separate category. Belarus and Ukraine, for instance, are completely different. The Western Balkans is another area. So I mentioned Serbia. That's non-proprietary, right? It recognizes there are other actors that have activities there, but Russia maintains strong influence in the Balkans. And this is an area that it considers its general sphere of influence. It likes to counter and check other aspirations there when possible. So when those nations there want NATO membership, Russia will have subversive activities to try to counter that. A few years ago, it was well publicized that they interfered in elections in North Macedonia. They've tried to do things to stop NATO aspirations of those countries because they consider that an area of their interest. The Black Sea is another. The Russians consider the Black Sea their lake, heavily militarized. They have all sorts of naval vessels there with great capability. The Turks, the Bulgarians, and Romanians, who are all NATO allies, have a fraction of what Russia does. And then when foreign warships like ours come in, we have destroyers that come in periodically and do freedom of navigation sails through there. Those ships are always shadowed. They're always by other vessels. The Russians will do simulated strikes against them, all sorts of things. So they consider that their territory, and they let us know. And then finally, the Eastern Mediterranean. So that's not Russia's unique personal space, but they have a strong interest there, and they let us know. So when US ships are there, the Russians have a strong presence, and they let that be known partially because they have a naval base in Syria, in Tartus, that this is an area that's their particular sphere of influence. Okay, so Russia's grand strategy, what are the ways? So the ways that Russia tries to implement their strategy are generally the following. Okay, so this is my view, and some might take some issue, but these are the general ways. The first is they want to divide NATO and EU or US cohesion. So they like, whenever possible, to divide the alliance. If they can do it politically, if they can do it in the information sphere by spreading bad information, they love that. But politically, they do this a lot. They like to divide Germany and the United States, or the French and the Germans. If they can divide NATO so that's not a cohesive group, or divide the EU so it doesn't have a unified policy, or just create havoc, they're happy. The second is, generally speaking, to undermine Western credibility. Russian media loves to show their system of government, which is more autocratic, as an alternative way to Western democracy. For Russian television, which you might see abroad, if you might have it at your house or on a hotel room when you travel, they love to talk about how even African nations, which are a complete mess in their mind, have Western democracy. That democracy doesn't do you any good. Democracy is just a mess. In the US, they're always showing racial strife, They made heyday in early January with the activities that happened in the Capitol. They love to show that we're a hot mess. So any problem in the West, they like to highlight as, see, these guys don't have it together. We have an alternative way. And that creates disunity and provides support for Russia. The other is state capture. So state capture implies that when you have a smaller nation, that Russia can either politically dominate through a debt trap, where that country owes Russia so much money or so indebted through oil sales or something that Russia has de facto control, or in the case of Ukraine before 2014, where they owned the oligarch that was in charge. So the president of the country was kind of their guy. They paid him off. They can do that. That's also a form of state capture. So those are ways the Russians often employ. They love to foment instability in the US and Europe. And for those who don't realize it, the Russians are very active and have been active for decades in trying to foment instability in the US and Europe. I can only talk about some of that, but much of it you've seen. They spread lots of disinformation here. They'll have political groups that are legitimate groups, and they will channel money to those groups. So if you have a group with a legitimate grievance, some of you who lived through the 60s, remember there were student groups that were protesting the Vietnam War. Research has shown that although student groups were legitimate groups, but a lot of them got money from Soviet fronts for their activities. So in the words of Billy Joel, they didn't start the fire, but they love to fan the flames. And that's something that they do in the US and Europe a lot. Finally, territorial issues and frozen conflicts. That's been a favorite play in their near abroad, where they do it in Ukraine now, they do it in Georgia, with Moldova. They like to have little slices of territory that they're liberating, and then they end up kind of quasi-owning it. With the exception of Crimea, Russia typically doesn't want to own the real estate. So they don't want to pay for it. They just want to cause trouble there and make it difficult for another country to either come into NATO or be closely aligned to the West. So what are the means, right? So the first that you might be aware of is energy influence. Russia is an oil and gas state. They're a petro state. Their government is funded by oil and natural gas. That's where they get most of their revenue. But it's a declining mean, and I say that because they have not been modernizing their oil fields and their pipelines as much as they should, and so they have difficulty producing what they should. There's a lot of discussion about how Russia's infrastructure is declining in petrochemicals, and so this is something to watch in the future. They're just not putting the money in for modernization that they should, and because of sanctions, they can't have Western companies come in and help them modernize. Other means is disinformation and propaganda. They're the best. I'm writing one of my large papers here is on Russian disinformation and propaganda, and they're exceptional at it. And the more and more you dig into the research, the more you realize how good they are at it. Even when we're aware of it, sadly, we are not countering that probably the way we could. And they spend lots and lots of money on, even externally, just on disinformation and propaganda to sow discontent and hate, frankly. Cultural diplomacy, which includes religions, the Russian Orthodox Church or cultural centers are a way that they use to achieve their means. Military activity, so military operations are one, like in Syria, but they also have military exercises with partner nations or in their near abroad that cause all sorts of tension and discontent. And then technical assistance to autocrats. So in Africa, particularly, that we see now, they'll have some strongman there, and the Russians will send technical advisors or contractors down there to help him, stay in power. And that assistance is looked at favorably by some of these governments who are looking for an alternative to U.S. democracy. And I finally put strategic nuclear arsenal as a means because it should be remembered that Russia remains the only country in the world that is a true existential threat to the United States. Their nuclear arsenal is vast and very capable. And that's always something that's in the back of everyone's mind. That's why we treat Russia the way we do as a peer, because they have a nuclear arsenal. If they didn't, I think they would be treated differently by many people. Okay, so Russian fissures and areas of weakness. And I'm sorry I'm running through this so quickly, but I want to make sure there's time for discussion. There's scarce data, but there is some evidence and some research by the State Department and others that Russian elites view domestic problems as more important than great power competition, which the Kremlin cares about. So this is an area that I think could be exploited in the future, but it's certainly an area of weakness where Russian elites recognize there are domestic problems in Russia, and there's dissatisfaction, and they care a little more about that than I think President Putin and some other of the Russian security services care about great power competition. Akin to that is Russia's domestic economy is very, very weak. Its consumer economy lags behind. Lots of people, including China, still depending on petrochemicals, but it's resilient. And since we've had sanctions in about 2014, Russia's economy has been very resilient in doing what they call import substitution, where they've managed to take, particularly in the realm of agriculture, instead of importing food from Europe, they've developed ways that their manufacturers can produce the same thing. And so they've been pretty resilient. That doesn't make the population particularly happy, but it means that they weather sanctions pretty well. And so people who think sanctions are going to solve all our problems are, I think, a little misguided. Finally, Russia has not achieved its goals in Ukraine. Their invasion of Ukraine, I think, has actually unified Ukraine somewhat, which was an unexpected outcome, I think, from Russian strategic goals. Okay, so how do we counter Russian influence if we want to, right? How does one do that? So these are Steve Lacy's ideas, right? I actually stole them from other people, but I won't cite them, so you can assume that they're mine. And I have to also say, I should have said up front that these are my personal views and not the views of the Department of Defense or the U.S. government or anyone with a better haircut than I have. So just recognize that these are my thoughts, but there's a number of academics and analysts who agree with me. First is exposing propaganda and disinformation efforts. If there's anything that I think we all could contribute to, it's that effort. Russians do this a lot. They even have, this is publicly available knowledge now, they have a number of these type of sites, but there's one outside of St. Petersburg. The Russians actually had in 2016, when they were interfering with our election, they call the Internet Research Agency. And they have a little building outside in the suburbs of Petersburg that's about 200 people who work in a building who do nothing but sow propaganda and disinformation. They're basically internet trolls who go out there and spread disinformation and lies. Can you imagine, like 200 people who that's their sole job is to spread false narratives. And that's just one group. And no one does anything about it, really. So it's something that we could do more of. The second is strengthening our transatlantic partnerships or alliances. We need to do more of this. So somebody asked me a question in the breakout room about what I thought about certain US policies, which I can't publicly comment on. But what I can say is that strengthening transatlantic partnerships like NATO are hugely important. They mean a lot to our allies, and they do a lot to protect all of us from these narratives. I have found that even when there's political problems between ourselves and another country that I've worked with, that when I'm working with my military intelligence counterparts that are, because we're all in the same NATO club, we can get a lot done at our level that people can't get done in diplomatic missions. That there are problems there that because of political issues can't be solved, but we can work on issues that sort of keep the conversation alive. And those alliances have so much value at so many different levels of government and quite frankly, in the private sector. Another way is to encourage energy diversification in Europe. It's really important that Russian energy is not the sole source of energy in parts of Eastern and Central Europe. And so that diversification is really important so that leverage isn't there. And then finally, observing Russian-Chinese relations. That's an interesting one because when the Russians and Chinese have competition amongst themselves, it takes the pressure off of us. So I think that's an important one to recognize in the big picture. Okay, I timed myself 22 minutes. Michael, I think I did a pretty good job of coloring within the lines. So I'm going to open it up to questions, however you want to do that, Michael, and I'll sit here quietly.
Yeah, we can feel free to people will just kind of raise their hand. Can I ask a quick question or point out that Putin was just now going to be dictator for life? I saw it in the news today. How much of an effect does that have on the Russian people in terms of discouraging, you know, like being such discouraging news that they're going to be in this situation? Or is it like everybody's just fine with it? I'm just kind of curious.
I don't think it's a surprise to anyone there. And as I mentioned to someone who asked me this question before we started, and I'll kind of reiterate what I said. And again, this is my view. Russia has historically and currently does not have there's no way for someone like President Putin to have a succession plan. He can't just ride off into the sunset. His personal finances are intertwined with the state. I mentioned a good book that I highly recommend to people if you haven't read it. It's a few years old. It's called Kleptocracy. And I think it was Misha Glennon? I can't remember the author, but it's Kleptocracy. I have it on my shelf. And the great thing to understand is that there's no way for someone like President Putin to leave office easily or safely for him and his family. And so from a pragmatic standpoint, I understand why this was done, is that in many of these countries around the world who don't have systems like ours, there's no way for there to be a bloodless transition. And so I think you just have to recognize the realpolitik nature of that in Russia. It's all well and good to have a successor, but there has to be a better mechanism for that to occur, rather than just someone else taking power and then Putin being at the whim of potentially people that he's done wrong in the past. So I think that's just something that you have to recognize, is that I think the Russian people understand that because that's been their historical perspective.
I have a question.
Just one second. We have an order here. Owen Johnson was next. He'd raised his hand.
I'm curious, first of all, since I grew up in Washington, it's great to have somebody from the Apple capital of the world, the same state that gave us General Mattis. What I'm interested in is an area that you only briefly mentioned at the end, that is the relationship with China, because it has its Belt and Road Initiative, which is cutting on the south part of Soviet interests. And I would also add Turkey and Central Asia, all Turkic peoples. My friends in Azerbaijan appreciated Turkish help. They were not happy when Russia came in to mediate the Nagorno-Karabakh complex. To what degree is that going to affect what's happening in Russia?
Those are huge questions, but let me try to answer them as succinctly as I can and give you some wave tops. So with China, there is a level of the Russians and the Chinese don't trust one another, state to state. In fact, when the Chinese buy things from the Russians, there's an understanding that they will reverse engineer military hardware or steal the technology, much like they do from us. So I think that there's a natural level of competition there and a pragmatism in there. Things are transactional. So I would describe the relationship as very transactional there. Second, when you move into Turkey, and actually my next assignment, I'm going to be the Director of Intelligence for NATO's Land Forces Command in Turkey. So I'm actually headed there a few months. And so I'm particularly interested in Turkey. And what I can say is that activity, I think, shows a growing resurgence on the part of the Turkish government to create and forge closer relationships to other Turkic-speaking peoples in the region, and is a counter to Russian influence in the area. So it's one to watch. Very interesting how that will play out. We've had a lot of tensions, between the U.S. and Turkey that have been well publicized, but I think that this is Turkey's way of asserting itself and saying, hey, we're a player too. And so that regionalism will be important. So I think it is worth watching. It's a good question, but it's certainly a sign that Turkey is not willing to be Russia's doormat, put it that way.
Judy Schroeder was next. You're muted, Judy.
That was the most interesting presentation. Thank you. I have two questions. One is income inequality an issue in Russia? And second, does the US government and other Western ally governments have equivalent troll factories?
Ooh. Let me answer the first. I'll answer those in turn. I think I can answer both. The first is a great question. Income inequality is always a factor. I think it's a factor in every civil society. But it's less of an issue than it was probably 10 to 15 years ago, in that the Russians have come to some, this is my own personal perspective, there's some level of acceptance of the status quo. So in the late 90s and early 2000s, there was a lot of frustration by income inequality because it happened so rapidly. And I think there's a level of cynicism that has permeated Russian society. I think that's probably the best word, cynicism, toward that. The vast majority of people in Russia muddle by. So there are oligarchs or people who, but you're either a have or have not in that society. And quite frankly, most of the haves tend to be centered in places like Moscow or Petersburg. So more than just income inequality, the real problem is there's a huge disconnect between the centers of power and the regions in Russia. So when you talk about Russia, you'll see that written, the regions are really important because there's wide discontent in the remote regions of Russia. And Moscow, for anybody who's visited, is not Russia, it's Moscow. It's like coming to the United States and you only visit New York, you're like, oh, this is the US. That's not the US, that's New York, right? It's different. And it's the same thing with Russia, that Petersburg and Moscow are not reflective of the rest of the country, but they hold all the power right now. But there is discontent. And so rather than just think of it as income inequality, I think of it as regional inequality. Second question about troll factories. I can honestly answer that question as no. We don't operate that way. And actually I'm delivering a presentation at the school in a few weeks about Russian security services and how they're different from us. There's so much written about this that I can talk about it publicly, which is great. But the reality is that we're much more defensively minded, which you might think of as a weakness, and yet it's a great strength. Our intelligence services are focused on analysis and collection first and foremost. So we are less overtly operational in the way we conduct intelligence. We're a little more passive because we're here to provide our policymakers and our political leaders who we respect. And even if we don't like what they do, we follow their orders. In the Russian system, there's far more competition between security services. So there's a little more what I would call the cowboyish nature. They take things upon themselves. And they're offensively oriented. They look at intelligence as an offensive activity rather than a defensive activity, which is why I, as a US military officer who's in intelligence, I can say that publicly. In Russia, you would never do that because people would understand that you are acting in an offensive mindset and you're probably focused on counterintelligence and disruption abroad. So it's a completely different way of conducting intelligence.
Charlotte,
We're
is
the
it
good guys.
up next?
Okay, I have two things. One may be irrelevant, but what was the effect of Catherine the Great on the history of Russia? And the other is what kind of social network is existent now?
I'm not sure I can answer that question properly in the time that we have. What I will say is that the benefit of some of those Russian monarchs, including Catherine, was they provided greater European integration. The downside to Catherine the Great, and I would make this criticism of some of the other Russian leaders, is that they did not allow, so I talked about that lack of enlightenment. Yeah. Catherine initially looked like she would be someone who promoted greater integration, but she ended up being more of an autocrat who suppressed intellectual and political development in the country. I think she, like many of their rulers, retarded their growth. So I would say that was one of the downsides, was that she didn't do enough to allow for political development, which in later decades in the next century created problems. And that's been a long-term problem in Russia, but that's just my own reading. And I don't remember what the second question was.
Social network, the social service network.
I'm not sure I can adequately answer that question.
I should say the socialist network.
The socialist network?
Yeah. We talk about socialism.
Can you be more specific on what you mean by that question?
Well, I'm just thinking the state-operated support for everyday life.
Oh, I see. So, I mean, the experience with communism that Russia had,
yeah.
Russia is a much more communal society than ours. And that causes problems, I think, this is a broader question, but when we look at other countries, and, my career is focused on working with partners and allies, the hardest thing for Americans to understand is that we come from a very individualistic society. We are not a communal people.
Yes.
We're certainly not a communal people right now. I think that's pretty evident politically, but socially, we're not either. And in many of these societies, including Russia, they have always been very communal. Russian landed estates historically were places where you had a landlord, whether or not he was absentee, and a communal land system that even after serfdom was eliminated, it was very communal, and you had communal councils. So communism was easier, I think, to introduce there because it was a communal culture. So places that have communal cultures tend to embrace socialism or communism or their derivatives much more easily than places who have a strong sense of individualism, like you do in the West. And so I think that was certainly a factor.
So it continues.
Absolutely. But remember, socialism is something that all developed societies have elements of. I don't want to get into too much political discourse, but
sure,
we have elements of that in our country, and it's not all bad, right?
Yes.
The 1930s, the New Deal was Satan's plan, according to some people. And now elements of that we love, right? We love some of our social programs. So as societies modernize, I think there's elements of socialism. They're always going to, have a social network. But they're, Western society struggles with how much is too much. So
thank you.
Dave Meyer's hand was raised next.
So thank you so much, Colonel Lacey, for your fine presentation. So my quick question is about climate change and its effect on Russia, kind of the threat and opportunity it presents to them. And what does Vladimir Putin really think about that, if he thinks about it at all?
They do think about it. It's a good question. So there's a thing called the Northern Distribution Network that you may have heard of. Sometimes it's called the Northern Transportation Network. So the Russians believe, they've done an assessment, and this is all publicly available information now, that the Arctic corridor, that is right above Russia, there is there's the ocean, many seas that are covered with ice much of the year. And with global warming, it's now possible to ship goods along that corridor for longer than they could in the past. Russia believes that this is going to be a source of revenue for them somehow. And so it has actually militarized that area, and they've had new icebreakers come into the area because they want other countries to ship along that border, because it's so much more cost effective than going around through the Straits of Malacca, Suez Canal, if you're trying to ship east to west. And in fact, the Chinese are very interested. Now, it hasn't borne a lot of fruit, but there are more transits now than ever before. So that global warming has opened up a sea passage in the north that didn't exist 20 years ago. And Russia is very focused on the Arctic for that reason, because it sees it as a commercial opportunity. Also, when you have global warming in the north and you have seas that are a little more open, there's the potential down the road for drilling technology to access hydrocarbons. But right now, Russia doesn't have the technology to really do that. And with Western sanctions, that's dead in the water, but they're looking at something in the future to, greater extraction. So that is something they're very focused on. Great question.
Colonel Lacey, thank you so much. Do you have a few minutes to stay after the close of our presentation to address a few more questions?
Yeah, I've got a few more minutes before my next activity, so I'm happy to stay.
Okay, well, we need to close our program quickly, and then we'll get to the next few questions, but thank you so much for your presentation. I need to quickly draw our next speaker recognition recipient here, because it's the fourth quarter, and it will be Monroe County United Ministries will be our fourth quarter recipient. So we will be giving a donation in your name, Colonel Lacey. And Sally, would you please tell us about next week's program?
Next week on Zoom, we will hear from Dr. Amy Hewitt of the University of Minnesota. She'll be talking about direct support professionals and unrecognized essential workforce.
Fantastic, that should be great. All right, Natalie, can we have the four-way test to say that together to close out? our meeting. Of the things we think, say, and do. First, is it truth?
Is it
truth?
Second,
Second,
is it fair to
fair to all concerned?
Third,
Third, will it build goodwill,
friendships.
better friendships?
Fourth,
Will it be beneficial to all concerned?
and fifth,
Is it fun?
Yeah.
thank you. I believe Alon Barker was next with the question.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you so much for an incredible conversation. That was really, really impressive. So in the past, I guess I want to just start with the assumption that foreign policy is part of public opinion, right? And it's not always completely aligned, but it's certainly governed, ultimately by public opinion. And what's been fascinating about the last 4 years is how perceptions of Russia have shifted. Within the administration, certainly our president had his opinion about it. And I'm just wondering if that's shifted the dynamic around foreign policy in the United States in regards to Russia in particular.
So I would probably, I'd probably say that what we saw in the last 4 years was a pause. And what I mean by that is that the policy that the current administration seems to be engaging on is probably a continuation of what you had under the administration before President Trump. So I think it's more of a continuation of policy rather than a change. That's at least my own personal view. I think had we had a different administration in 2016, had Hillary Clinton won, I think we would have had a continuation of the policies that we had previously. In fact, I think that was something that was concerning to the Russians, for sure. And so I don't look at it as so much of a change as it is a continuation of many of the policies. Now, what I do think is that there has been initiatives in government for more people, and I observed this because I was at the Pentagon at the time, and I have observed that we now have far more people who understand the problem set than before. So when in 2014, when Russia invaded Ukraine, I don't have time to tell all the stories, but we have some really good stories, by the way. But I was one of the very few people who understood what was happening in Ukraine. I was at U.S. European Command, and I ran the Russian military forces branch for our analysis center. And we could count on one hand the number of people, including myself, who kind of understood the problem. And I could tell you in the US government, there were very few people. We were getting calls from all over the US government on what the flip is happening in Ukraine. Tell us why. And I had senior leaders that we had to explain, and I had to really kind of walk the dog on why this was a problem, why the Russians were acting this way. People just weren't aware. There is now a lot more awareness in government broadly of how Russia operates and what their interests are. So if there has been a change, it isn't so much a policy change, but it's an awareness of what has happened. And I think that that's really useful because so much of what we do in government is making people aware, right? The whole knowledge is half the battle idea. So I think that is one thing we have seen more of is more knowledge. And you'd make the same probably argument with China, that whether or not our policies have changed, there's a lot more awareness of what's going on now and of some of the challenges and potential threats than there was ever before. And I find that really encouraging.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Steve Engel was next.
Thank you again, Colonel. That was a really interesting presentation. My question is, how seriously do we need to take Russia's military since their GDP, annual GDP, is smaller than that of Italy's and less than 1/10 the size of the US?
Good question. So I'm going to answer this in a couple of ways, and I love this question because it leads me into something I like to bring up when I speak. You're going to hear a talking point a lot about how the US spends so much more in terms of raw dollars on our military than any other, than the next two militaries combined. You've probably heard those statistics before, that talking point, right? The challenge is that we spend our military dollars here in this country at our labor rates and our technology rates. So we spend about 3% of GDP on defense, roughly. because it's very expensive to produce planes and tanks and pay for soldiers. I mean, I'm very expensive to the US government. It costs them a lot of money to send me here to IU for a year. I'm just being honest. So we spend a lot of money on our military because, quite frankly, we have a system that, in order to pay people like me, we have to pay a lot. Russia pays a lot as a percentage of their GDP. And so when they produce a tank or a plane, or they pay a service member, it's really in rubles, not dollars. So you have to look at it quite differently. Same with the Chinese and others. It's not what they aggregately spend in world amounts that's important. It's what they spend as a percentage of their dollars that's important. So in kind of answering your questions about how concerned we have to be, other than their nuclear arsenal, we're not that concerned that they're going to have a Red Dawn type scenario. The Russian paratroopers are not coming out of the sky to take us over, and we're not all going to, raise our hands, Wolverine, and have to defend the homeland that way. That's a very unlikely scenario. And I don't think they have the capability to do that. But they can challenge our adversaries, and they can disrupt. Basically, people we have alliances with, they can cause problems in there. And so it's more about us defending our alliance and our economic and political interests than it is about defending the homeland. And a military, has that role. I mean, I am not a naval officer, but our Navy's role is to defend the seas, right? Is to make sure that those sea lanes of communication and trade are open. And so when you ask about what the risk is, what the challenge is, they have certainly a capability to interfere in places we have interests and alliances. And that's what concerns us the most, I think.
Thank you.
Aaron Davis was next.
Yeah, hi. I've been picking up on something sort of disturbing, given that I know a little bit of Russian history, and that is a thought out there: that Stalin wasn't so bad. Is this part of the disinformation campaign, or?
That is actually a part of official Russian communication to their population. So the Russian state has recharacterized the conversation. It's actually illegal in Russia to denigrate Stalin. I can't remember the exact law, but you can't say that anymore. You can't. They will harass you, and it will not be good for you if you publicly say bad things about Stalin now. That's not to put him on a pedestal, but they're changing the historical narrative to go back to this era of World War II was our apex. Those were the good old days. There's a revisionist history that has been going on. And so that's less of an external narrative, but what you're seeing is leakages from the internal propaganda that the younger generation is being given. Now, that doesn't mean that everyone buys into that. There is some healthy skepticism in Russian society, I think. And the younger generation doesn't have the same nostalgia for communism, which is a good thing, I think. But the downside is the younger generations, both in the US and don't have that legacy. I can tell you on a personal note, and this is the other side of the coin, right? I audit some classes here at IU with a lot of undergrads who, could be my kids now. And I take classes on 20th century warfare or 20th century politics. And some of these kids just have no frame of reference for, that era. Like, communism isn't necessarily bad to them. It's a meme. And that's, there's an entire generation growing up that doesn't have the perspective that all of you in this room have. And so I think the same thing is happening in Russia, but what it portends is tough to say.
The people in the Ukraine have their own history and remembrance of Stalin.
Absolutely. And the peoples in the periphery, right, in the former Soviet republics, they are not kind to that memory. But people within Russia proper, there is a little bit more glorification of Stalin than there was 10, 15 years ago. Good question.
Martha Foster.
Yes, I've worked in media most of my life, and I'm very interested in what is being done and what can be done to counter particularly the social media misinformation. It's just really disturbing.
It is to me, actually. So the answer is not enough, sadly. Actually, I wrote my paper here on why we need to bring back the U.S. Information Agency, for those who remember what that was. We need a more whole of government approach. That's just my personal opinion. I can't advocate for the government, but my argument is we're not doing enough, and I think we're not doing enough as individuals, frankly.
What can that be?
Yeah, and we're not doing enough as a government, right? So we need to kind of smack it down where we see it. So if you see information online that I think it's really important for people not to be passive when things are shared that are obvious disinformation or written from a political slant or a social slant or just non-critically thought of. I think it's important for people in a nice enough way, if they can, to say, I don't think this is balanced and objective. I think this is propaganda, and call it out, because people have been cowed into not doing that. It's hard because it puts you at risk on platforms like social media, but I think that's where we have to have a little, I think, more personal chutzpah and just push that through. So that's hard. I mean, I think as individuals, here in Indiana, that's what I would tell people is we have to take more responsibility to combat these types of things in our own families, in our own communities.
Thank you. Thank you.
Great question. Thanks.
Michael Shermis.
Yeah, Steve, so I'm just kind of curious on the personal level. When was the last time you were in Russia? And if you went today, would you immediately be considered a spy or?
I think I can answer this question. I worked with my counterparts before we were unfriendly, before the Sochi Olympics in 2014. We did security work before the Olympics down in the Caucasus region. Now with what I have done since then, I can't go back. So I don't think I could get clearance for my own government to go. And if I went by myself, it might be a one-way trip. So I wouldn't do that. Okay. So no, I am not, it doesn't mean that I would end up in the gulag, but it wouldn't be good for me. So I couldn't go back. In fact, my wife wanted to take a cruise, in the Baltic states and go through St. Petersburg. And I don't think I would get off the ship just because, they wouldn't detain me. I don't think if I had a visa to go in, but I might sit in a room with a couple of my best friends for, all day. And, as my visa was scrutinized. So yeah, I can't go back right now. So, which is unfortunate, but I can go to other places near there. Yeah.
Alon Barker raised his hand.
Yeah, so sorry to pester you with all these incredible questions, but this is such a fascinating topic. And I just want to mention that the Dean Emeritus of the Jacob School of Music in 2005 was part of a group that came out with a report, a Department of State report. Yep. Sorry. A Department of State report on cultural diplomacy, soft power. Yeah. And they had a lot of very interesting recommendations that were actually suppressed by the State Department for a period of about 2 years before there was a lot of pressure on the State Department to release it, because they were basically saying that the sort of the hard power that the US exudes and uses is sometimes counterproductive.
Yeah, it's a great question.
And that they had a whole lot of recommendations, including a cultural exchange that they felt would make a huge difference to the ultimate goal of rectifying the problem rather than simply defending against it. So I'd love to get your opinion about that.
Yeah, like as I mentioned earlier, a lot of my research is on those issues with the former USIA, and the State Department now, all of those authorities have been subsumed to the State Department without quite frankly, the resources to do them properly. And cultural diplomacy was a big part of what we did in the 50s and 60s, up through the 80s, really, in this country. And it's something I think that's a bit of a lost art. So I, as a military officer, kind of take a different view, where many of my counterparts who tend to be a little more operationally focused, it's all military solutions all the time, right? And that's the way they're brought up to think. It's not their fault. It's just what they do. I have the freedom and luxury to think differently. And my view is that military is only one of the many components that we have of national power. And diplomacy is an underutilized resource, but diplomacy also encompasses public diplomacy. And the information realm is one that we struggle with because we're not used to thinking about it that way. And we have real trouble in the United States thinking about the term propaganda, right? If I say propaganda, everybody flips out like, oh, propaganda, we don't do that. But all states have to get their message across, right? They have to have a message and a narrative, and they have to promote that. And so if you don't promote it, you leave it to the free market. And we've seen what happens when we leave our state message to the free market, you know, the laissez-faire economics of the media, and what a disaster that is right now. I mean, there's so much polarization in media that it's absurd. And I think from foreign policy, at least, maybe we don't want to do that domestically, and we have laws against that, but from a foreign policy perspective, we can't allow US media conglomerates to put forth our message. That needs to be something we do in a concerted way. But that's difficult, and those are hard conversations because Americans don't like that idea of putting forth our message, and yet it has to be done. We're 27% of global trade in the world, the US. Whether or not we want to have a leadership role in the world, it's here, right? And so if we want to have a smaller role in the world, then we need to accept a smaller economic footprint. And I don't think we're ready for that. So we should get our act together, I think.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Tim Jessen, did you have a question?
Yes, I was with you in the pre-chat, and you did a wonderful job here talking all about these issues and being very nonpartisan. And I could ask you about the influence of the Russian Orthodox Church in Serbia and so on, because I write about religion. But my question is this: could you tell us a little bit more about your training that you told us in the chat room and the various places that you went to study and why?
Oh, you mean that the training that they've talked about, my formal military training?
Yes.
So I'm in a very small career field. I don't know how interesting this is to you, but the Army has military intelligence officers, and there's a few thousand of them. And then there's about 300 of us that are strategic intelligence officers. And so our role is to operate at the joint and interagency level. So my job is basically to work at places you've heard of, like combatant commands, right? You've heard of CENTCOM maybe in the news, or EUCOM, European Command, or PACOM, and national agencies like Defense Intelligence Agency or CIA or NSA or one of those, or the Pentagon. And so my focus and my role in the military is to work at the strategic or national theater strategic level. That's fun, but it also means that you have to have some prerequisites for that. So a lot of my the Army likes a guy like me who has operational experience. So I have experience in Afghanistan and elsewhere. But for the last decade, most of my training has focused on working at those levels. So we take a lot of courses, and a lot of my training is actually on how to operate within military staffs and work with foreign partners and operate in kind of the bigger picture, and operates at levels that maybe some junior officers or those who are more tactically focused would struggle with. Because we're going to delve into things of policy and those type of activities that a lot of people can't. I'm actually in this job because of my educational background. So I was a lawyer. I don't want to bore you, but I spent 4 years on active duty in logistics and hated it. And so I went back and went to law school, which was always my plan. And then a couple of years after law school, the Army sent me to Afghanistan as a reserve officer. And I did some intelligence work, which I hadn't done before. And then they said, "You're really good at this. You should do more of this." So they induced me back. And so I have a background in business and in law, and that's been highly useful because it allows me to work with other organizations that, my background is helpful.
When were you at Penn and Brigham Young?
I was at Penn from 93 to 96. And then I was only at BYU for 2 years after that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Stephen, we want to be respectful of your time.
I don't mind. I'm actually blowing off another course that I'm going to, but I told them I'd be late. So totally fine.
Okay. Martha, go ahead.
Yes, thanks. I wanted to go back to the topic that Alan Barker brought up about cultural diplomacy. I had I just want to give you a little anecdote. I worked with the State Department with a program called the American Documentary Showcase in the teens and thereabouts. I led delegations of American documentary filmmakers to Myanmar and China. And that program only lasted 4 or 5 years. And it was just extraordinary what we could do. I was able to work with the diplomats that we had in Myanmar. We didn't have an ambassador there, but we had charge d'affaires to show some American documentaries on Myanmar television. They requested that after our visit to, and every one that they selected was on development and environmental issues and so on. I also, when I took a couple American documentary filmmakers, we did presentations in 4 major areas in Myanmar, including in Yangon, where we were introduced to some people who were called former military officers. And they at first were very, very cold and very suspicious. And we showed a documentary film about the restoration of America's tallgrass prairie. And I led the discussion saying I grew up on the edge of this prairie, and to talk about an aspect of American life that they had absolutely no expectation to hear about. And these gentlemen were very warm after the presentation. They shook hands, had photos taken with us. And I think the power and the value of the cultural diplomacy is just astounding. And I'm so happy to hear your support for it. So
no, it is. In fact, bring these back to, I think I mentioned one of the breakout rooms, might not all know this. I was a Key Club lieutenant governor back in the day. So when I was a kid, so I have some experience. And what I have found is that some of the programs that we have that are legacy programs that you may not even be aware of were programs that came out of our cultural diplomacy in the 50s and 60s. So sister city programs, right?
Yes.
Those all came from our People to People program in the 50s under the Eisenhower administration through the U.S. Information Agency. So those programs are really important. And some of what people do privately are programs that the government originally started, right?
Yes.
So we have, I think, an obligation to do that. And it's channels that government people are never going to break through. And it's really important for us to have that. So I'm a huge fan. Music organizations that go and visit, like there's a lot that can be done to build bridges. And in the Soviet era, when we had troubles between countries, those were the groups that could break through. So in fact, there's a book I'm going to recommend. It's really long, but it's good. It's more like a textbook, but I really like it. And you'll find some nuggets in there if you're interested. It's called The Cold War and the United States Information Agency.
Oh, good.
It's kind of a Bible on the topic, and I really liked it. It's got everything you ever want to know. And so if you're interested in those issues, they have chapters on cultural diplomacy you might like.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, Charlotte, will you take us home?
Yeah, I will take you home. I'm just, I was part of a cultural exchange. My husband taught at the University in Bratislava, and nobody came from Slovakia, but that was supposed to be an exchange. But my question is, one of the things that was so important to the people that we knew there was Voice of America. And I don't know what's happened to that. Is Voice of America still there?
So yes, Voice of America, in 1999, when the U.S. Information Agency was disestablished, which was a really bad decision.
Yeah, bad decision.
They folded Voice of America under the Board of Broadcasting, right? So there's a quasi-governmental organization called the Board of Broadcasting that has Radio Free Europe and Voice of America. So they made them a little more independent, right?
Mm-hmm.
But they don't have the funding that they used to have. And they receive their policy guidance still through the State Department. So they have been what I would call neutered, right? They're a shell of what they used to be. The other thing we need, though, is we need to modernize what Voice of America did for the digital age, because People don't listen to radio like they did before. And the next generation that grows up is it needs to be digitally oriented for YouTube or those type of mediums. So what we need to do is we need to take something like Voice of America, and we need to have an army of people who do the same type of thing, but they do it in ways that people consume now, videos and other forms of mediums that they'll consume. And we could do it, but we're a monolithic group of people sometimes, in both in government and privately, and we don't think those are those things, and we need to get on board. So we need to be innovative. And I feel like sometimes we're not as innovative as we should be, but we need to modernize Voice of America and that idea. Absolutely.
Mhm. Thank you very much. You're wonderful.
Thanks for having me.
Terrific coverage. Yeah,
Thank
makes
you so much. That was great. That was very interesting, and people loved it. You could tell by the questions.
Good. I'm glad it was useful. So
thank you.
Yes, I'm not sure we've stayed this late, so I appreciate you taking the extra time.
You're welcome. You're
and
welcome.
answering your questions. So
I love this stuff, so I nerd out all the time. Is what I do. So
What was the name of that book again?
the Cold War
and the
and
USA.
the United States Information Agency. It's by a guy named Nicholas Cull, Cull, and you can find it on Amazon because I did. So yeah, it's a good book. I mean, it's like I said, it's really long. It's kind of a comprehensive history, but you can find things you'd like about it in there, and I think it's really good.
What about what's happened to Peace Corps?
Peace Corps still around. That's a good organization too. So we have a number of initiatives. In fact, I wish we had more people who engaged in them. So.
all right. Well, I think we'll wrap up for today and let you get to your next thing. So we appreciate you so much, and you're welcome back anytime.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.